All right, I'm going to get started. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see many of you, or at least see your names. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar called The Deal with the Spiel, Creating LGBTQ Inclusive Purim Programming, put on by Keshet, Mishkan, Cohere, and Svara. I'm really excited. The folks who are from those various organizations are on this call and will be introducing ourselves in a few minutes. And first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Zoom in case you're unfamiliar and how to use that. So I hope that you can all hear me. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Great. Okay, people can hear me. There is a mute and unmute button. I set it so that you were all muted when you came in, but if you want to say something, you can unmute yourself. On the bottom left-hand corner is a mute unmute button. If you can keep yourself muted if you're not talking, that would be great, and that will really help cut down on background noise. You can change your Zoom name if you want us to know what your name is by clicking on the ... in your little square. And you can also include pronouns if you would like to. You can see that my name says Essie, they, them, those are my pronouns. And I'll also just show that throughout this presentation, there are little definitions in boxes. So if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say pronouns, I'm talking about the part of speech that refers to people in the third person. So we'll have a question period at the end, but if you have a really burning question that you want to get out there right away, you can use the chat function. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little speech bubble that says chat, and within that, you can send a question or a comment to the entire group. You can also send it privately to the person who's talking or to me. I can keep track of questions that way if you want to send me a question. There's also different view options. So you can do speaker view, which makes the person who's speaking really big, or you can do gallery view where you see everyone. And if you double click on a square, that should make that square big. And this is being recorded. So we'll send out the recording afterwards. You can share it with all your friends who couldn't make it, but do know that it's being recorded. I know some of you have video on, some of you have video off. That's totally fine, whatever is your preference. But if you'd like to stop your video or start your video, again, it's on the lower left-hand corner. And that is Zoom. Great, so now we'll just introduce ourselves. We'll just go in the order of who's listed on this slide in no particular order. So my name is Essie Shachar Hill. I use they, them, and theirs pronouns. I am the Chicago Education and Training Manager for Keshet.
Hi, I'm Monica Gomery. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director of National Learning at Spiel.
Hi, I'm Ari Moffick. I launched a program called Cohere a couple of years ago, and I'm here with a lens towards raising a transgender child and what I can add to the conversation from that point of view.
Hi, can people see me okay and hear me? No, maybe not.
We can see you. Yeah.
You can see me. Can you hear me also?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm on my phone temporarily, so I can't actually see myself or any of you, but I'm going to get there in a second. Lizzie Heidemann, rabbi, founder of Mishkan Chicago, she, her pronouns, and so happy to be in virtual space with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm also going to add that Daniel Boehner is on this call. He's the one who's sharing his screen with this presentation. He is the National Director of Education and Training with Keshet. So thank you, Daniel, behind the scenes.
Cool.
Great. So these are our goals for today. We will be understanding the context of Purim celebrations, understanding why we do what we do, thinking about and understanding why and how Purim celebrations can be unsafe for LGBTQ people, especially trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people. Again, I'll draw your attention to some definitions on the bottom if you don't know what those terms mean. And I'll just go over those briefly. So when we say trans, it's an abbreviation for transgender, which is an umbrella term referring to people whose gender identity is not the same as the one they were assigned at birth. Non-binary is a gender identity that rejects the idea that there are two genders. It's a gender that's not man or woman. And gender nonconforming describes a person whose gender identity or expression doesn't conform to the cultural or societal expectations. So you will probably hear those terms a lot today as we talk about those populations. And our last goal is to learn best practices, tips, tangible things you can do to maximize fun and safety while minimizing harm. And I got a note in the chat that potentially audio doesn't work so great on Safari, but it works on Chrome. So if you're having issues, you may want to try logging back in on Chrome. Thanks for that suggestion. Great, so we are going to start with a text study from Rabbi Monica.
Thanks, Essie. Hi, everyone. So we're going to look at two texts together throughout the course of this call, the first one being now and the second a little later. And I just want to say by way of introduction that I'm a faculty member at Svara, and if you're not familiar with Svara, we are a yeshiva. We call ourselves a traditionally radical yeshiva, and we specifically are a home for the study of ancient Jewish texts through the lens of queer experiences, queer perspectives, and queer lives. So this is a good fit to get to study some text together in the context of this call. And I know that after this text study, we're going to get to hear from Lizzie about the hows and whys of Purim observance. And so we're kind of zooming out first to look at some of the kind of meta messaging in the Talmud, in some of our ancient, earliest foundational Jewish texts that relate to the practices of Purim. And I'm sharing these texts both for us to get into the content of the call today, and also as texts that you all can use and teach and share in your communities as you contextualize what you learn from this call with the people you work with. So with that, we're going to check out this first block of text that you should see on your screen share here, which is from the Babylonian Talmud, from Masechet Megillah, which is all about Tractate Megillah, which is about observing Purim. So we're going to divide the text up, the first paragraph and the second. And I'd love for someone to volunteer to just read us in English the first block of text, that first paragraph, so we can hear it. Any brave volunteers?
I'll volunteer just to see if my speaker is working.
It's working, thank you.
Okay. Rava said, a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until he does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Rava?
Thank you, actually great. So let's pause there because that's quite a bit of information. Thank you so much. So I just want to open up to you all. Let's make sure we understand what this text says. The text is telling us that we have an obligation in practice, a mitzvah, to become intoxicated, to drink enough wine or alcohol on Purim. And then this next part's pretty intriguing, to not know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. So I'd love to hear a couple thoughts from you all. You can see, I'm not sure if you can see it on this screen share, but there are some questions at the bottom if you open up the doc that Essie sent out ahead of time. And so the first question is just, what does it mean to not know how to distinguish between Haman and Mordechai? What do you think that actually concretely means? And I'll just say that there's definitely no wrong answer to this question. It's a pretty obscure concept, so this is a very open to interpretation statement. So just jump in with any thoughts or associations.
And a reminder that you'll need to unmute yourself.
I would just say you get so drunk that you're very confused.
I think too, it doesn't state that you can't differentiate between Haman and Mordecai, but specifically cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. So the differentiation between blessings and curses being turned upside down, I think, is significant.
Great, thank you. So, and sort of going a level deeper, I'm curious because I'm assuming that for some of us, we might be encountering this idea for the first time, and for others of us, this is a very familiar frame for approaching Purim. So I just want to take us a level deeper and ask what opportunities for growth or for learning, for liberation or transformation might this kind of a mental state, this confusion or the sort of turning around of categories of the villain and the hero of this story, what opportunities might it allow for, might it create? In other words, like, why would this be important to the rabbis who are sort of constructing the practices of observing Purim?
Perhaps because they believe that the ability to distinguish between sacred and profane is at the core of your connection to, or one of the aspects of your, or understandings of your connection to holiness.
I love that. Thank you. Great. So that's something about that line between sacred and profane actually gets us closer to an elevated or a transformed or a sacred state on Purim. Any other interpretations of this practice?
And just to either go with what Scott just said or go the opposite direction, I'm not sure, is that line between sacred and profane. It seems like that maybe we're, every single week we make Havdalah, we talk about, blessed are you who distinguishes these things. Like, distinguishing is this very important thing that we're constantly doing. And that somehow on Purim, we're deliberately supposed to make it so that we have a harder time doing that. And so that what we think is good could be bad, and what we think is bad could be good, and what we think is a blessing might be a curse, but the thing that we think is a curse might actually be a blessing, and that's part of, the process of coming closer to liberation, is actually sort of taking down the preconceptions that we might have had about ourselves or other people, and they're being blessed or cursed in our minds, and being like questioning that. At which, like, I'm thinking of the last scene of Superbad, that movie with Jonah Hill. Do you remember that movie, Jonah Hill and Michael? But like, you know what I'm talking about? I don't know. Yep. Whatever. It's like these high school kids who are like trying to be macho and cool and whatever. And in the last scene, like one of the last scenes, they're so wasted and they're in sleeping bags and they're like, I love you. I love you. And they're like saying I love you to each other because they're friends. But like, they couldn't say that when they weren't drunk. And that I feel like there's something about Purim that's like, get to that place where you can actually say the thing or know the thing that you might not have been able to access when you were sober or in a different frame of mind.
Great. And sorry, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think too, it gives you the opportunity to explore these characters in different ways. If you can sort of flip the script on how they've been defined, to say like, you're not pigeonholing these characters in the same way if you're able to see those different characteristics.
And I just want to ask a little more from you, Sarah, if you're willing to share, so what becomes possible when you don't pigeonhole?
Well, you get to see a whole person. You know, I think about this with my own children and the children that I work with so much, that once you've defined someone as good or bad or smart or whatever the characteristic is, you're not seeing the whole person. And if you're able to assign, you know, different qualities to someone, even just to play with it, even just for a moment, you get to see them differently. You get to see yourself differently too. Like, how can you redefine yourself if you know, sort of strip away how you've been defined and spoken about, and like how liberating that is for us and for, you know, the people that we work with.
Great. And I just want to highlight what both you and Lizzie, I think, are getting at, which is there's a personally liberatory opportunity there to re-understand and to sort of open up the space to redefine how we understand ourselves and how we see others refracted in a new way, and that blurring these categories might actually shed more light, not less, on the people in our lives, on the ways that we frame who we are, who they are. Great. So there's a lot more to say about this idea, but we're opening up, like, what is the opportunity of, what is the liberatory opportunity of Purim? And I want to also just briefly touch on what are the risks, which is this second paragraph. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to similarly open it up for some discussion. So this is the immediate next passage in the Talmud, which is a story about two rabbis who are friends or colleagues observing Purim together. Rabbah and Rebbe Zera got together for the Purim Seudah feast on the afternoon of Purim. They got very drunk, and Rabbah got up and cut Rebbe Zera's throat. The Aramaic literally says Rabbah butchered him. It's very graphic. The next day, Rabbah prayed on Rebbe Zera's behalf and brought him back to life. A year later, Rabbah asked, "Would you like to have Purim Seudah with me again this year?" Rebbe Zera replied, "One cannot count on a miracle every time." End of story. So a lovely Purim was had by all. Some lessons were learned. So this is a pretty extreme story, and I'm curious to hear some thoughts on why you think the rabbis told this story about Rabbah murdering Rebbe Zera on Purim. What lessons does this story foreground that they might be trying to teach us about this holiday?
Well, in juxtaposition, the two stories, you have the first story that says you're actually obligated to lose touch with reality and have some kind of cathartic experience at least once a year. So you rethink it's almost like a high holidays of drunkenness. Like, you have to have this, you need a moment of deep catharsis once a year, even if you have to get to some type of substance to get you there. And then the next one says, but don't get there so far that you lose track with your responsibility to be, you can't murder people. Like, you can't go all the way. You can't lose so much reality that you think it's okay to kill someone. I think they were really kind in using this story to not just leave the story as it was, like someone got so drunk on Purim that they killed someone else. The end. There was this one got in because there was a spiritual nature to it. Like, there wasn't. He did kill his brother, you know, his a fellow rabbi, but God brought him back. But otherwise, I don't know if it would have gotten, if it would have made it into the Megillah, into the Talmud, if there wasn't the miracle.
Great. And there's that sort of lesson at the end, lest we think this is just a tragic cautionary tale, which we actually could still learn a lot from,
Right.
But there's actually explicitly a moral being given to us from Rebbe Zera's perspective. He's learned some foresight, and he's cautious in a different way. This might actually have ruined Purim for him, and he is not trusting of Rabbah in the same way that he was the year before. But I love what you were saying, Scott, about there has to be a check on the cathartic experience. On the one hand, go deep, mix things up, sort of lose yourself in the liberatory potential of Purim, and beware of some very, very serious, that there can be some very serious consequences, and that this kind of comes as a check on the first piece. Any other thoughts on that, or did any other readings of this paragraph?
Yeah, I had a thought about the consequences piece. Like, not only does it say there can be consequences, but also you're responsible for those consequences. So you're still responsible for your actions, even though you're getting so drunk that you can't tell the difference. Because, like you said, he has a different idea of this rabbi now. Like, he sees him differently. He's like, I'm not going to your Purim party because I see you differently now. And so we have to remember what we do tonight or on Purim is going to follow us in some ways tomorrow.
Right.
And-
It's
and
it's
like,
okay to
less-
lose.
oh.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, lest one read the Talmud and just think like, oh, it's like interesting deconstruction of a story in the Talmud. I can think of specific real world examples in which people who were inebriated did and said things on Purim that for them were embracing their Purim truth that almost got them fired, did get them fired from jobs, that hurt people deeply, insulted people in ways that like will stay with them long after the holiday is over. And so, there's this, Jews celebrate things in community. So anything that we are exploring on our own, our sort of shadow side, our distinct, blurring the line between good and bad. But the second it threatens or hurts somebody else, we've crossed the line, is I think what the Talmud is maybe suggesting. What were you going to say, Scott?
It's okay to lose the different. It's like it says you're obligated to lose the understanding or be able to, the ability to discern between curse and blessing, but choose blessing. Even in the ad, you might lean towards blessing.
Yeah. So in a lot of ways, it's the tension and the sort of harmony between these two texts that is the basis of this webinar, which you all are lifting up, which is that the opportunity of Purim is to break down boundaries and to really see that even to the extent of not being able to distinguish between like the greatest villain and the greatest hero, that our tradition foregrounds in the Megillah, in the story of Purim. And there are so many liberatory opportunities there, and we're really encouraged to go for it, and even obligated, even commanded to do so. And that that is not without ethical responsibility. And actually that part of what we're talking about today is to make explicit something that's often invisible, which is that power dynamics are at play in our observance of Purim, and that the stakes are really high. The stakes can be life or death, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, socially, and physically. And that tension is built directly into how we come to even conceive of Purim at its origins in Jewish tradition. So, and it's my experience, to echo what Lizzie said, that I'm often in communities where we don't have a shared language around those ethical boundaries and responsibilities, and that we haven't really done enough of the work to think about how our liberatory experiences of Purim don't, butcher someone else's liberatory experiences of Purim, to use the language of the Talmud. So, any other closing final thoughts on these two texts before we hear more? Okay, thank you all for your learning. I look forward to learning a text with you again in a little while.
Great. Daniel, could you go forward one more slide? Great.
You want me to pick it up, Effie?
Yes, please. And you can just say next when you'd like the next slide.
Great. Hi, everybody. if and when you jump into conversation or noticing anything, just just say your name, because a lot of you are not on the video, so I can like scroll down and see who's talking if you're talking on video, but if you're talking on just your speaker, it helps to just announce who you are, so that then I can refer back and said that thing that Sarah said or that Scott said was really interesting. Thanks. Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Monica. That text, I just think it's so good. So for a lot of people, I think, especially adults, Purim becomes this holiday of, oh, it's the day we like dress up and get drunk. And a lot of the rest of the context of what the holiday is like really about, or sort of other ways to access Purim in addition to getting wasted, get lost, like people don't even know them. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes to like get back down to ground level of where does what we do come from? Like who fixed the rules in the first place, and then how might we adapt or live them now? So next window, Daniel. Great. We don't have to read this in Hebrew. I just wanted you to see that in a moment when we go to the English, it was a lot of text to put on one page. But I wanna highlight a few words here before you go on to the next one. For people who are following me in the bold, on that second line, I just want you to see some words here. This is from Megillat Esther, from the Megillah that is named for Esther, one of the main characters in the Megillah. The character who begins as an orphan, is adopted by Mordechai, her uncle, and basically put into King Ahasuerus's harem when the opportunity arises to maybe become a new queen, when he deposes his old queen for not following instructions and probably dancing naked for his friends. And she rises to power, and I may be telling you a story you know already, or I may be telling you a story it's been a while since you've heard. She rises to power. She learns that her people are threatened and that the king actually is supporting a policy of ethnic cleansing for her whole people, and has to work up the courage to confront him and then to change the policy somehow, or allow her people to fight back. So this is after all that happens. In the 9th chapter of the Megillah, it's sort of like an epilogue, like at the end of the movie when they put the words on the screen of like, and here's what happened to these characters after the story was over. Because the people save themselves. They're allowed to fight back. It's actually pretty brutal the way that they save themselves. They're not just doing defense. It also kind of looks like they're doing offense. But at the end of the day, you know, as the story goes, they came to kill us. We're still here. Let's eat. So the text describes, I'm just going to give you some words in Hebrew that we're going to see in a moment in English. On that second line where it's bolded, Chodesh Adar. So this is from the Megillah. It's a reminder that we're going to be in the month of Adar, Arba'asar, the Chodesh Adar, the 14th day of the month of Adar, which is still the day we celebrate Purim now. Simcha u'mishteh, joy and, anybody know what mishteh is? It's the same word in modern Hebrew for a beverage, imbibing, drinking. So joy and drinking. Yom Tov, maybe that looks familiar, like a holiday. Umishloach manot ish l're'ehu. Have people heard of this thing, mishloach manot? Anybody want to venture a translation?
Scott, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Scott. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm still trying to negotiate this.
There you go. Now we can hear you.
Zooming thing. I am zooming for the first time here. So I'm just trying to get my settings worked out. Sorry. Sending of gifts.
Yeah. Ish l're'ehu, like each person to a friend. And so you already get the sense of this being a holiday. It's celebrated on a particular day, which we still observe, the 14th of Adar. It's joyful, there's drinking, it's a holiday, and also, mishloach manot, ish l're'ehu. This isn't just about you having a good time. This is also about you taking care of people and giving gifts, mishloach manot, people to their friends. And then that's made even more clear down below. Again, look at the Hebrew, that's bolded. Mishloach manot, ish l're'ehu. Now we're like, 9 lines down from the top in the bold. And then something else is added, matanot le'evyonim, which means gifts to the poor. And these, now go to the next slide, please, Daniel. Thank you. Now you can see it in the English. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who lived in unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of joy and feasting. Mishteh is sort of, it's drinking, but it's also just, sort of the whole atmosphere. A party, a holiday, a Yom Tov, and sending gifts or portions to one another. And Mordechai wrote these things. So when we get up and say at the beginning of the Megillah, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, like Baruch atah Hashem, like blessed are you, God, who commanded us to do these things. God is actually not mentioned in the Megillah anywhere as having direct responsibility for any of these things. And we actually hear that Mordechai is the one who wrote these things down and sent letters to the Jews in all the provinces of the king of Ahasuerus to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of Adar and the 15th day of the same, to remember when the Jews could relax from fearing destruction from their enemies. And the month was turned for them, v'nahafochu, which is, again, that same sort of state of mind of switching things up so profoundly that, bad becomes good and good becomes bad. Nahafochu, it was turned for them from, can anybody actually just finish the English from there down to the bottom? Maybe somebody who hasn't volunteered yet. Brave people. You got this. Someone. Somebody want to read English? Someone who has read already or spoken? We're trying to make this not too much of a one-way conversation. We're basically where the arrow is, if you move up 4 lines from where the arrow is, the month which was turned for them. Okay, great. I'll just keep reading.
I'm happy.
Thank you, Liz.
And the month which was turned for them from sorrow to joy and from mourning to a holiday, simcha mishteh v'yom tov, that they should make them days of feasting and joy and of sending portions to one another, mishloach manot ish l're'ehu, and gifts to the poor, matanot le'evyonim. The Jews confirmed and took upon themselves and upon their seed and upon all who joined themselves to them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing and according to their appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed.
Thank you. Great. So my one question I have is, based on reading just these 2 paragraphs from the Megillah, which seem to outline what this holiday is, how the holiday is observed, what are the main mitzvot of Purim? And on whose authority do we do them? So question 1, what are the mitzvot in the first place?
Well, so we have the mishloach manot, the gifts to each other. We have the gifts to the poor also.
Okay, cool. Got 2.
The simcha mishteh, the joyous celebration and drinking.
Yep.
Well, and then there's the hearing of the Megillah.
Where do you get hearing of the Megillah as its own mitzvah?
I know. I'm trying to figure that out. Keep these 2 days according to their writing, according to their appointed time every year. These should be remembered and kept throughout every generation. So in that remembering, it's the reading of the. I would
I, something like that for sure. Because at the end of all of this, what we come out with is 4 basic mitzvot, and then what's sort of like the dubious or ambiguous 5th, which is what we just read about with the rabbi saying one is obligated to get totally, like completely wasted. Is it a 5th mitzvah, or is that sort of where one could take simcha umishteh, eating and drinking? And there's actually a whole, it's not a huge literature, but there is a small literature of alternatives to drinking to get into a state of mind that allows one to blur lines or be in an altered state. So some would say you don't need to get trashed, you just need to drink a little more than you might on a regular night to be a little looser. You get another rabbi who's like, hey, I know a time when you can't, distinguish from reality, when you're sleeping. So maybe, what we all need to do is basically like have a glass of wine and fall asleep. Or, any other, like spin in a circle 25 times or something that essentially allows you to see the world differently. In any case, the idea that there is an actual commandment to get drunk, I think that's sort of a fallacy. And I think that's important to say, because one doesn't need to, for sure, anybody who's in recovery or for whom it's actually dangerous to drink shouldn't do that. Pikuach nefesh, the saving of a life, like preserving of life, that's like, that remains top category of Jewish legal priority no matter what or when. But also, like, you don't need to have that as an excuse. Maybe there's just a different way that you're going to access an altered state of mind, or the ability to think more expansively than we usually think, for the purpose of what exactly?
Well,
why? Yeah.
Am I on? I don't know if I am.
Yeah, you are, Scott.
Okay. I was thinking about feasting and gladness, and maybe I should have an end point before I start talking, but maybe you'll all help me. The beginning of the Megillah starts with the description of the king's feasting, that there's that he's throwing this party that lasts for 120 days.
80 days, right?
80 days. So you've got that as a bookend in the story itself. But now we go to a point of that I was wondering if maybe this isn't a comment on or trying to help us understand insane gratitude, like being grateful for being saved to the point where you lose all self-control. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? That this response that Mordechai writes, and that we should all party and celebrate to the point of losing your grip on reality, is also a response to being saved and to having gratitude for that. Okay. And I think there's other ways we can extrapolate that into appreciating and understanding other people's sense of being saved and finding themselves and who they are, and being ecstatically grateful for that. Is that?
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Any other thoughts that just came out of seeing this or remembering this? Something that I think is really interesting is this line the Jews confirmed and took upon themselves. In Hebrew, the kaimu v'kiblu, is basically what the rabbis of the Talmud use as the explanation for how we can justify that we practice Judaism at all. And the reason is, like, 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the giving of Torah at Sinai, but the rabbis basically look at that moment as this coercive moment where a powerful God with a booming voice said to the people, you will accept the Torah. And they were like, okay, sure. And so the rabbis of the Talmud say, well, wait a second. When somebody is coerced into doing something, that's not consent. That's not freely willed acceptance of anything. And the legitimacy of that moment then is completely called into question, in which case, why are we practicing Judaism at all? And the rabbis say, good point. Here in the time of Ahasuerus, Mordechai and Esther and the people essentially confirmed and retook upon themselves the heritage of Judaism, and decided from that point forward it would be written like on their terms, in a sense, and so it was. And again, this is like the big booming patriarchal character of God in this story is completely absent, which I think gives a lot more creative license to the people, and by extension to us, to think about how do we want to put into practice these really, I think, well-intended mitzvot that are very human, that were created, conceptualized by, as the text says, people, and to celebrate out of a sense of gratitude, as Scott described, not just celebrating for ourselves, although, yeah, definitely celebrating for ourselves, a sense of survival and gratitude, and then also sharing that. And how do we share that? We give food away, we give money away. The texts actually say, like, if you're a person who tends to be scrupulous and exacting in your giving, like, don't. On Purim, just like, you know, go to the cash machine and get out a stack of 20s and like give them out to people who you would probably any other day wonder, like, but what are they really going to do with this? You know what? Like, life deals hands differently to people. And if you're in the position to share and see how that feels, maybe that will alter your consciousness and be able to put yourself in the position of someone else. Which I think then gets into where I believe our conversation is going to go, which is, you know, as we're thinking about dressing up and creating communal spaces where people are going to be experimenting with what you're wearing and how you're speaking and how you are like embodying this alternative reality in which we both care for each other and also in which things are turned on their heads. How do we hold both? Shall we, let's go to the next slide. I can't really talk about Purim without making reference to it's a super short piece that I want to recommend to everybody. This is from my teacher, Sharon Brous. And I would say, like, after this call, if you find this interesting, you should just like go read the essay. It's a page and a half. But is there somebody who could read this in English? I think this will take us into our next chapter.
I'm happy to read it.
Thanks.
The reversibility of fortune, the capriciousness of life, is a message Purim shares with Yom Kippur. Known in the Talmud as Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim, Yom Kippur compels us to reflect on the unavoidable uncertainty of our lives. But on Yom Kippur, we dive into this terrifying reality with austerity, reflection, and spiritual wakefulness, whereas on Purim, we respond by celebrating, imbibing, and masquerading. Our rabbis teach that on Purim, we are to ply ourselves with wine, drinking ad Delo Yada, until we can no longer tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. We wear costumes that simultaneously mask who we are and reveal the part of ourselves we work all year to hide. We eat, drink, dance, and laugh in the face of our darkest fears. The possibility that human life and human history can change on a dime. That everything we know to be true could be a farce. That everything we love might disappear in an instant. That there is more chaos than order in the world. It is an exercise in radical spiritual destabilization. And the response is the closest Jews come to carpe diem, one day a year when our otherwise exacting tradition understands that sometimes drunken revelry is the only reasonable response to desperate vulnerability.
Thank you. Take a moment to just like look over that, and then any comments? Does this seem resonant? Does it seem like the holiday you recognize?
It just really makes me think that every year I say, like, gosh, this year we really need Purim. Like, oh, and again, this year, like, we really need Purim. Sort of that continual sense of relevancy, you know, no matter what's happening in the world, like something wacky is happening, and whatever's happening in our own lives, like there's been some shift, some need for release to, you know, get that pressure valve released. And I think this piece just encapsulates that idea so perfectly.
I was going to say maybe the opposite of what you just said, Sarah, which is every year I think to myself, Purim is my least favorite holiday. And I just feel so like resentful of being mandated to be joyful. And there's so much excess, and it's, you know, I'm an introvert, so it's like terrifying to take on all this overstimulation of celebration and costumes and all the fanfare. But I really appreciate the reframe in this text that actually it's not about excess, it's about precarity, and it's not about irresponsibility. It's actually about human vulnerability and the opportunity to experience that from a different angle is a really helpful way to think about what's the point of Purim.
We studied this today in our staff meeting, and somebody remarked that we spend so much of our lives trying to protect ourselves from being vulnerable and feeling vulnerable. And this piece actually begins with Rabbi Brous describing being in New York on the day of 9/11 and just seeing people pouring out of bars and music thumping and people responding to this completely out of nowhere sense of precariousness and unpredictability with celebration, you know, with like carpe diem. And that sometimes that can feel like this very dissonant thing, but also, you know, as she says here, sometimes drunken revelry is the only reasonable response to desperate vulnerability, which we know is present all the time everywhere. And somehow Purim, we create like a microcosm where we actually, like, we create those conditions intentionally. And I think the spiritual challenge for us, and then I'll stop talking, is to allow ourselves to actually be vulnerable and to take care of ourselves and each other in that state of vulnerability, which we're agreeing to create together. Those are part of the kind of the conditions of the holiday, is creating a sense of vulnerability if we're actually doing it. But then that places an incredible sense of responsibility on us also to take care of one another's feelings and bodies in order for it to really be this Yom Tov, this holiday, a good day. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think it's interesting because I'm right here in the suburbs, kind of in, you know, out here, Purim is often just centered around it's on Sunday school. It's during Sunday school. That's the time families, you know, observe it. And it's based on a carnival, a Purim carnival. And so we are focused on how many prizes there are and what teenagers are staffing which booth, and, you know, are there enough tickets for the pizza? And it's really interesting, and it's hard to bring in these deeper themes, I find, of Purim in that context. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, thank you so
Maybe it
much.
has to do with the vulnerability piece, that we just avoid that and so focus on.
Totally.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's also possible and probable that, like many Jewish ideas and holidays, there's kind of a way that we celebrate it with kids to make it interesting and accessible for kids. And then there is a deeper, more philosophical, even darker way of understanding it that as we become adults, we have to lean into. Otherwise, the holiday feels really meaningless and stupid. And like it's just about presents and masks and, you know, silly carnival games. And then adults rightly say, like, this is a dumb holiday and a dumb religion, you know? So I feel like there's an important invitation, as you say, to both like keep it exciting and interesting for kids and try if there's some way to connect. And also, you know, that the ideas we're talking about might be ideas that one comes to understand more deeply as an adult.
Great. I'm going to keep us moving. That was an awesome framing to kind of get us thinking about the intentions and the themes and the point of Purim. And now we're going to focus more on some of these tangible things that you can do when you're planning your Purim programming. A lot of this section is about costumes. Because that's a common way that we celebrate Purim, and it can be super liberating, and we will talk about the positives and the empowering possibilities in a few minutes. And costumes can also cause a lot of harm, which is what we're going to sort of address now. So if you can go forward, Daniel. Thank you. So this is a quote to get us started from Rabbi Emily Aviva Kapoor, who is a trans woman rabbi, and I will just read it aloud. There are definitions on the right-hand side for some words that might be new. When I see cis men on Purim dressing up for comedic effect as women, I do not see myself. The comedy hinges on the fact that men trading down by dressing up as women are funny because being a woman is funny, and men being women is even funnier. This kind of humor is rooted in the intersection of transphobia and misogyny. So we see a lot of like cross-dressing on Purim. So that's what this is referring to. This is referring to cis men. So men who are not transgender, men whose gender identity aligns with the one they were assigned at birth, dressing up as women kind of as a joke to be funny on Purim because it gets a laugh, because in a lot of parts of society it's seen as funny. And this is a reflection on that and how harmful that can be for people who experience their gender and the world differently. Next, please. Okay, so some do's for keeping in mind when you're planning your Purim programming. So do talk to young people and adults about the power of costumes, good and bad. So kind of the conversation that we're having here today, don't just leave it in this webinar. Please take it to your communities, have these conversations with your staff, with people who will be at the celebrations, about how Purim costumes can be really liberating and harmful, as we saw in that quote. So just a note on that, like why it can be harmful, for example, for a cis man to dress up as a woman as a joke. First of all, it's sort of, it often relies on the fact that, like, as that quote showed, men dressing up as women is funny, which can be really transphobic, meaning like it's really offensive and hurtful for trans people, because for trans folk, that this is an identity that they have always. They cannot just put it on for one day a year as somebody dressing up as a woman for Purim might. So one great thing about Purim is we do kind of create this safe space for people to try on different things and have different expressions in a safe space, which is awesome. And it's really important to remember that that safe space for many folks, like trans people and non-binary people, doesn't exist outside of that room. So that's just something to keep in mind. So encourage people to consider the intent versus the impact of their costumes and choices. So intention is what somebody personally might mean by dressing up as something or wearing a certain costume, and impact is how that's actually affecting other people, and sometimes those can be mismatched. So it's important, even though I'm not trying to hurt anybody with my costume, it might be hurtful, and thinking about that impact is really important. Thinking about heteronormativity and cisnormativity. So heteronormativity is sort of the belief that being straight is normal and natural and the best way of being. We are raised in a heteronormative and cisnormative society, so if you have these attitudes, it's just how we're socialized, but it's really important to be aware of them. So don't assume everyone is straight. Don't assume everyone is cisgender. Try putting on these this different lens, this new lens, and thinking about how things might be different at your celebration or in your space or in your community without heteronormativity and cisnormativity. And the final point on this slide is about alcohol. So we've talked a lot about alcohol and getting drunk. And as Rabbi Lizzie mentioned, that's not a viable option for everyone. Some people are in recovery, choose to live a sober lifestyle, particularly in the LGBTQ community. 20 to 30% of people are in recovery from some sort of substance use. So that's a lot higher than in the non-LGBTQ community. So keep that in mind and have alternatives, and don't pressure people to drink. Great. So do make sure you have gender inclusive bathrooms available. That might mean converting one of your bathrooms into an all gender bathroom. Keshet has really awesome signs that you can put on bathrooms that I will send out after this webinar in our resources page. And that's a good practice to always have, but particularly this might be the first time you're thinking about implementing that. Think about incentivizing sort of non-harmful costumes, or creative and authentic expression. So I have been to Purim parties where there's been a themed costume contest, and that is a really great way to get people thinking creatively, not reverting to harmful and easy costumes. For example, last year Mishkan had a really fabulous Purim party, and there was I can't remember, it was a conceptual costume contest. So people sort of dressed up as puns. It was really fun and a good way to kind of steer people in one, a more creative, and two, less harmful direction. And also look beyond Purim. So as we said, it's one night, it's one day in our Jewish calendar, but think about your culture on a larger scale. And in that vein, you could consider giving tzedakah, or these mishloach manot that we talked about, giving food, giving care packages. Think about who you're giving those to. You could make a bigger statement. You could do some outreach, and you could even donate to an LGBTQ youth center or a homeless shelter, which could be a really cool opportunity. Ari, do you want to talk about this next point?
What's the next point?
Talking to young kids ahead of time.
Yes. Okay, yeah. One thing about being explicit, I think about costumes when you're planning, when there's going to be families and kids there. At our public elementary school here in the suburbs of Chicago, there was a tradition, longstanding tradition, that the fifth graders, which is the oldest class in the elementary school, the fifth graders on Halloween, the boys dress as cheerleaders and the girls dress as football players. And this is how it was year after year on Halloween. And after some conversations with the principal about how when the boys dressed as the cheerleaders, they were mocking girls, it was sexualizing young children, it was misogynistic and transphobic. He sent a letter to the school. And if anyone wants to see a copy of the letter, I'm happy to share it, because I think it has really good wording for religious school directors or anyone who has families and children coming, and his letter was about costumes and intent. And I think it got to why, it got to something that I've seen happen with my own child when my little one was gender nonconforming, was a gender nonconforming toddler and young child. You would see what looked like a boy in a princess costume, let's say, and we might picture scenes where you've seen little boys in princess costumes, and a little boy in a princess costume. What happens often is that the adults have a big reaction to that. It makes people laugh. It makes grown-ups nervous. And it makes grown-ups often have to like defend it or explain it. Like, oh, well, he has a big sister, or all little kids love sparkles or something. But if you see a little girl in a Spider-Man costume, it often has the reaction of, you're so strong, what a cool costume, that's so brave. And so it's a very radically different reaction. Of course, not always, but a lot of the times. And so I think it's worthy of just seeing how teachers react and what we can do around that, and sending a letter about costumes, when we think about it for Halloween or for Purim, and that children should experiment on these days, and it's a great day to be creative and try all different things and feel safe to do really fun costumes. And, our intentions have to be not hurting anyone else. So that's I think that's really important. And I think it goes even farther for like not just Purim, but if you've seen, young teenage cisgender boys wearing tutus for Capture the Flag or for other games in Jewish settings, and it's to be funny or to have a high-pitched voice or to be like fluttering around, and what messages that sends and why why that sometimes happens. So I just want to share that perspective. And the other thing I just wanted to share is that, like, for my child and for a lot of transgender youth, we know they go through the world stealth, meaning that's a term that they use, and meaning that this is a private part of their identity. So yes, people may know, but it's not something they talk about or discuss with friends. And so, sometimes it's just another reminder that sometimes some of this stuff has to happen behind the scenes, and it's not always a great thing to go up to gender nonconforming or transgender students and ask them how they're going to feel if something happens or another, if that's not conversations that they have with everybody.
Great, thank you, Ari. And something I wanted to pull out from what you said, I realize there might have been sort of what sounded like a contradiction in what we just said of, Ari just mentioned, like, your child might have sort of looked like a boy in a princess costume, and that was really important for your child and a wonderful expression for them to be able to do this in this safe space. And earlier I said cis men shouldn't be dressing up as women, right? So that might sound like a contradiction. And the point to be mindful of there is this sort of is this person using this opportunity to experiment and kind of explore maybe a part of themselves or expand their own boundaries and comfort zone? That is a different scenario than somebody thinking, this will be funny. I'll put on a dress and lipstick because it will be funny and it will get attention and a joke. So that's sort of the difference there. And I wanted to make that explicit because I recognize that on the surface, those two things might look similar. Great. So the last point on this slide is if you're incorporating a drag show, which lots of parties do, which was really fun, know your drag etiquette. So as I mentioned, I'm going to send out a resource page after this, and it will have drag etiquette for you to know and to share. So we can do the next slide. Great. So a couple don'ts. So don't appropriate other cultures or races. So what I mean when I say appropriate is to take on certain features or costumes or mannerisms of a different race or culture, again, for comedic effect. It's just, it's not cool because those other cultures and people of those cultures and races can't just take that off at the end of the day. That's their identity. It's not a costume to be stereotyped or again, for attention or comedic effect. As we just mentioned, so don't shame young people for experimenting with expression. It could actually be harmful, like Ari just mentioned, like for Ari's kid, it might have been harmful if they had been shamed for wearing that tutu or that princess costume. Do not tolerate transphobic costumes, jokes, or behaviors, just really nailing that point home. Yeah, just don't, if somebody's telling jokes, you can challenge them. You can ask them, like, what do you think is funny about that? Can you tell me the intention behind that? You can approach it from a place of curiosity and get that person thinking, and just let them know it's not actually funny. Don't use misogyny or transmisogyny as a punchline. Again, to remind you, transmisogyny is the fear or hatred of transgender women. And don't assume all adults will be drinking, because some people choose not to drink for various reasons. Before we move on, was there anything, Ari, you wanted to add to that section?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. And just a reminder, we are going to have time for questions at the end. Great. So we just talked about a lot of things not to do and like how harmful costumes can be, which is kind of a bummer. So now I want to switch gears and think about the amazing liberatory and empowering potential. And Monica and I are going to talk about that next. Great. So as I mentioned earlier, Purim is awesome in that it provides a safe space where people can express parts of themselves that they otherwise can't. So that's fantastic. A lot of trans Jews have reflected on the fact that Purim was actually the first time that they were able to express their true selves. I read a couple of really great first-person essays of trans Jews who look back and think about how Purim was really liberating for them. And those are on the resource sheet that I'll send out in case you're interested in reading. And also, if you just think about the characters in the Purim story, it's really about breaking gender stereotypes and norms. Like Vashti, who refused to, as Rabbi Lizzie said, probably dance naked, and who was banished. She stood up for what she believed in. She wasn't going to be sexualized in that way. Esther uses her position of power and her own sexuality to save her entire people, which is amazing. And we don't have a lot of examples of sort of empowered women in that way. And Mordecai, who is this nourishing parental figure who maybe even nursed Esther, which is what we're going to talk about next. Oh, not next, just kidding, in one slide. So as I said, a note on drag. Drag is great. It's really fun. Just to remember that drag is different from transgender identities. So drag is like an exaggerated gendered performance, and transgender people, being trans is an identity that can't be taken off at the end of the night. And this is a picture of Lady Synagoga, who is a Jewish drag queen. Just thought that was super fun to include. And now we're gonna do another little bit of text study with Monica.
Thank you. Great. So as you mentioned, Mordecai as this nourishing parental figure, and I just wanted to showcase where we see that in text. So, and what I want to say about this is, as we're exploring the question of what are the liberatory opportunities in Purim practice in general is huge, and the possibilities are sort of endless, and we can look at them through the lens of gender and find a lot there for us. And you can zoom into many stories from Torah and see Chazal, see the sages, the early rabbis exploring the characters and their genders. You can see it with Abraham, you can see it with Joseph, just to name a couple other like core characters whose genders are really up for exploration, according to the rabbis. So this is one little window into that. as relevant to Purim for us to look at. So I'll read this text and open it up for discussion. So this is a midrash. This is a rabbinic. Someone said to me the other day that midrash was the original fanfic, which I think is true. Like the rabbis are cracking open Torah and saying, oh yeah, and also this happened and also that happened, and sort of loving the text and adding their own agenda and elaborating on it. So we're seeing that in this midrash. So the idea comes up that Mordechai feeds and sustains, and then the text sort of incredulously asks whether that's true, and then we have an interpretation. So Rabbi Yudan says, one time, that was fan fiction, Rabbi Lizzie. More to say on Midrash's fan fiction at another time. But so Rabbi Yudan says, one time he being Mordechai, went out to seek all the wet nurses, but he could not find one immediately for Esther, whose mother, Mordechai's sister, had died. And thus he nursed her. So he's looking for someone to take over as this sustainer for baby Esther. And in the absence of a wet nurse, he himself becomes her wet nurse. Rabbi Barachia and Rabbi Abraham in Rabbi Elazar's name said, milk came to him and he nursed her always, the implication being that he nursed her continually. So this is a sort of elaboration on that story. And then Rabbi Abahu teaches this publicly. It says, when Rabbi Abahu expounded this publicly, the congregation laughed. And he said to them, is this not in a Mishnah? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, and now he's quoting a Mishnah, the milk of a male is clean. So just to sort of talk through the steps, we first are given this image of Mordechai as someone capable of producing breast milk and exploring his sex, his gender, his role in this story. And I think what's important there to note is that the rabbis aren't asking, was Mordechai trans or not? What was Mordechai's anatomy? Like, they're not asking those kind of questions. What they're doing is opening up infinite possibilities for gender, for what Mordechai's gender might be, and who he is as an archetype of masculinity, of femininity, of a non-binary gender. They're opening that up for a reason. And I'm not going to tell you all what the reason is. You're going to tell me what you think. And then the community responds to this teaching with degradation and discomfort. They make fun of him. And I think we can see a lot of analogies to what's been shared already on this call about responding to explorations of non-binary gender or of queerness or of transness in a transphobic or homophobic way. So they sort of incredulously laugh at the possibility that Mordechai had a non-normative gender. And then Rabbi Abahu does two things. One is he says, wait a minute, this is in our tradition. There's something about this idea that a male can produce milk, breast milk, can nurse a child, that has precedent in our tradition. And he reaches back for this precedent from the Mishnah, from an earlier rabbinic text. And it's interesting because he's quoting a Mishnah that's not talking about a human male. It's talking about an animal. And so I just want to just foreground Rabbi Abahu. He's doing this really interesting thing where at face value, this Mishnah that he quotes to say our tradition actually has precedent for a wide range of experiences and expressions of gender and gender roles. This Mishnah that he's quoting doesn't at face value have anything to do with queer gender expression, but he takes the statement and he reclaims it as a liberatory affirmation about Mordechai's gender. And I think that is sort of the invitation of this text and the opportunity to go back to our traditions and use them to lift up lived human experiences in an inclusive way, in an affirming way, and in a liberatory way that's relevant to the people in our own communities. So that's my on one foot just walking you all through what's going on at each step in this text. And I'd love to open it up just for a couple minutes for other observations, things you're noticing, things that surprise you, or lessons from this text. Any questions or burning thoughts or shy thoughts that you're not sure if you want to share, but maybe you'll go for it?
I think, like, as with all text, when I read it, I'm always thinking about either what's missing or what comes next. So I'm curious, you know, he says, you know, he pulls this piece of text and, you know, brings it to them and says, here, like, I have this justification for this, and just ends there. I'm curious to know, like, how might the congregation react after that? You know, if this person is enough of an authority figure to say, like, this is it, like, end it, do they take that at face value, or where does that conversation then lead? And how are people maybe pushing up against that in the future?
Yeah, we don't, it's a great question. We don't know in this text, but I think it's a really good question to ask. And I also appreciate, Sarah, that you're highlighting that this is a role modeling of the role of a leader at Purim also, to sort of use authority, to use a leadership role to be able to highlight the lived experiences of so many different kinds of people, and to highlight that this is that like queerness isn't new in our world. It's actually very ancient, and we see it at some of the earliest stages of Jewish history. So we don't know how the congregation responded to him, but you're right to also point out that he takes a risk as a leader, and that really matters.
Yeah, I think also this is such a good model, as you were sort of alluding to, of like, this might happen at our Purim celebrations. Like, somebody might laugh at some sort of gender bending that's going on, and the response can be like, no, actually, like, I'm really serious. Like he does here. He says, it's in the Mishnah, like, it's there. And to your point, Sarah, of where does this go? I hope that it leads to a really fruitful conversation, and maybe like an educational moment of like, well, why do you find that funny? Like, let's kind of break this down, and let's think about our assumptions about gender. And I love this text because I think it is a great model for us.
I also love that this is the direction the rabbis took the conversation. So if this is fan fiction, it could have gone any which way. And instead of going the direction of, he went and found a wet nurse. She's unnamed. She's not an important part of the story, you know, but like he figured out how to deal with the problem in the normal biological way. They take it in this direction of, okay, let's affirm that like Mordecai was, as far as we can tell, a single guy raising a daughter, like raising a kid on his own. And, you know, his like sort of things that defy our usual sense of the order of things is exactly what happened in order to make that possible. Why? So that you should know that this kind of thing is possible and happens in the world. And didn't just like rest on, they could have invented a different story that was a lot more traditional and cohered with, you know, things that we would expect to happen. But instead they give us this. And I have to ask, like, wow, cool, why? You know, so that we would have this conversation.
Great. I'm so sorry to cut off this amazing conversation, but I am going to keep us going because we only have 7 minutes left and I want to address questions. So Daniel, if you could go to the next slide, and I will make sure to send out that second text in a follow-up email. So to kick it off, we got a great question from Tori. The Young Leadership Division at JUF is throwing a Purim party with Beis Hillel for 50 plus people. How do you suggest we encourage attendees to dress appropriately? So it's a great question because you can't necessarily control what people are doing, but I do think that you can include part of in an email or the invitation or whatever that's going out with the details, a note about being mindful of costumes. There's tons of great resources, some of which I'll send out, about cultural appropriation and drag and cross-dressing, and being mindful of that. And I think if you have any kind of correspondence beforehand, it would be really prudent and proactive of you to include that, and maybe offer yourself or somebody else as a resource if people have questions.
I think people might say like, oh, you're being too politically correct, or we can't have fun, or just lighten up or something. But I don't know, in my humble opinion, I think that this can be I think it's really important to stop the dressing as women as to mock women or to be funny. I think it's hurtful.
Yeah, I think you can emphasize that we're creating a safer space or a comfortable space, and that would kind of address that. What other questions do folks have? You can either put them in the chat or just pipe up. Remember to unmute yourself.
How do you, does Keshet have guidelines or resources for how to advise people to like apologize or make tshuva when they have screwed this up? You know, either as community leaders or as people in a community, you know, who are like well-meaning, but, you know, like screwed up.
That's an awesome question. As far as I know, we don't have a resource on tshuva and how to apologize for this specifically. We do talk a lot about if we misgender someone or use the wrong pronouns or the wrong name, how to address that, which is a slightly different question. But it would be a great resource for us to work on of tshuva.
All right.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here actually?
Yeah, Daniel, go for it.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel. I haven't had my video on, but no, that's a really great question. Something that we have sometimes suggested in the past around this topic is, especially with the potential cross-dressing, quote unquote, the gender play that could be going on, is to include some kind of educational component to your Purim celebration. Either have something on the table, like Essie had mentioned, of perhaps donating to an LGBTQ homeless shelter, maybe having some other type of educational component that talks about trans community, non-binary community, what we can do to support this community that faces discrimination on a daily basis for gender play, not gender play, but for living their lives in a way that a larger society does not always reflect back in the most affirming way. So perhaps offering some kind of further resources to explore. So perhaps some movies, some books, maybe have some books from trans non-binary Jews that you kind of put out on the table, or in the same kind of spirit of, if something were to happen, perhaps learning more about, not forcing the person who was harmed to kind of then educate the person who did the harming, but rather have some resources on hand to say, this is an issue that happened. It is not the burden of the person that has been offended to kind of continuously educate the rest of the world, but here are some resources that I would encourage you, maybe in partnership together with the rabbi or other spiritual leader or other religious school director, to kind of go through and that learning together. Just to kind of, because I would imagine that part of this is out of ignorance of not being exposed to this conversation and not being exposed to how this could be offensive to some people. That would just be what I would add to that.
Thank you. Final questions, clarifications? Okay, Daniel, could you go to the next slide? Great. Well, thank you all so much. This was really wonderful. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. Thank you to Rabbi Ari and Rabbi Monica and Rabbi Lizzie. I will be sending out a follow-up email with, as I mentioned, a resource page, some of the texts we didn't get to today, as well as a survey. And this is being recorded, so soon we'll have a recording, which we'll send to you, which you can feel free to share widely. It would be fabulous. We want lots of people to have this information. And I am available via phone, via email. If you do think of questions or any concerns or anything you want to chat about, I am happy to chat. So thank you so much. Any final words from the rabbis before we go? All right. Well, thank you everybody for your time. Chag
When it comes.
Yeah. When it comes. I hope everyone has wonderful Purim celebrations. You can let us know how it goes. That would be wonderful. And have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Essie.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, it was great.